Welcome, friends, to another edition of Global Capitalism. It's a presentation organized by Democracy at Work and the Left Forum. We do it every other month during the year as a presentation of the ongoing analysis that we undertake about the world we live in and how it is changing. The title for today's talk is The Decline of the United States Empire. Obviously, something that takes a good bit of time. It's already been underway for a while, but because of the importance of the United States still in the world economy and in world politics, it is an ongoing story that we must pay attention to as we follow its twists, its turns, its surprises, and its high and low points. That's really what we're going to be doing today. Before I jump into it, and we've organized it, I might add, around the military side, the economics, the politics, and then what comes next. Where is the decline of the U.S. empire taking not just the U.S., but the whole world? But before I do, I want to tease you a bit. We are about here at Democracy at Work, we're about to release another new book. It is a book I wrote with considerable help from the whole team here at Democracy at Work. The book is entitled Understanding Capitalism. And in a way, it marks the third and final volume of a series that began with Understanding Marxism, followed by Understanding Socialism, and now by Understanding Capitalism. We will be publicizing in detail everything about this book, including, of course, how you can get a copy in the weeks to come. I hope you look for it. I hope you get a chance to read through it. I think it collects in a very careful way the strengths and weaknesses, the criticisms, the myths and the truths about capitalism in a way that no one has quite been able to do before, partly because not as much has been revealed to us as has been now that the decline has set in. As it often happens with phenomena, it's when they're over their peak that you begin to understand the strengths, the weaknesses, the pluses, the minuses that probably were there all along, but now you see them in a kind of bold relief. So let's dive into the discussion of the decline of the U.S. empire. I'm going to begin with the military side of this story, not because it's the most important, it isn't, but because it'll give you an idea of what has happened that you may not have looked at this way, but now that the decline is becoming obvious, we can go back and see clearly what we might not have seen so clearly before. I'm going to begin, not that I had to, but I'm going to begin with the Vietnam War. I want to make clear that this was a war that the United States lost. The enemy in that war were, quote unquote, the communists of North Vietnam. The country had been divided. Communist Party of North Vietnam was the dominant political agent in the North, and in the South, a separate government, separate society, allied with the United States. And as that war exploded and drew huge numbers of American troops and the full force of the United States military, a war was fought, basically between the United States with this alliance with South Vietnam versus North Vietnam, who had its allies too. When the war was over, the United States had to leave Saigon, South Vietnam's capital, and the North Vietnam forces overran that capital, reunified the country so it is one Vietnam, not a North and a South, under the leadership of the North Vietnamese Communist Party. The war was fought against the Communist Party of North Vietnam, which emerged as the victor. And that country became Vietnam, as it had once been. And the United States lost that war. I say it slowly and with a certain rhythm because in my experience here as a professor in the United States, where I have lived and worked all my life, I am still struck by the number of people in my audiences who, when I finish explaining what happened in the war in Vietnam, let me see with their facial expressions and with what they say that they did not know that the United States had lost that war. The next war I want to talk to you about was the war in Afghanistan. There, the enemy was declared to be, and was generally understood to be, an indigenous political movement known as the Taliban. And the war lasted for several years, absorbed a significant number, not on the scale of Vietnam, but a significant number of American troops and American military equipment. And at the end of several long years of warfare, the United States lost that war. It had to leave Kabul, the capital, in disarray and quickly and with great fear and worry. And the capital, Kabul, as was the rest of the country, was very quickly occupied and taken under the control of the Taliban, the exact same political movement against which the United States had gone to war in Afghanistan. In other words, and using plain English, the United States lost that war. Next, we have Iraq, a society against which the United States military went to work, knowing that its enemies were largely those forces allied with Iran, also an enemy and a neighbor of Iraq. And after a long time, with much loss of life all around, some horrible battles, the histories of which have yet to be written, the United States, for all practical purposes, not yet 100%, but for all practical purposes, withdrew, stopped effectively fighting, and that society was taken over by forces that are closely allied with Iran, the enemy of the United States, according to the United States. That war, too, was lost. And finally, I come to the war in Ukraine. Odd as a war, a little different, because the United States is engaged, but not with troops, or at least we are not told about American troops that are there, but with American equipment, top to bottom, everything, and with American financing, absolutely crucial, without which that war could not occur. So Russia on one side, the formal combatant, Ukraine on the other, but the silent partner, if you like, is the United States with its allies in Europe along for the ride, sort of. The British, yeah, the Germans, yeah, but not too many others, and not much from those others. The war has been going on 2.5 years as I speak to you, and during that time, any reasonable observer, as to how things are going for the Ukrainians on the one side and the Russians on the other, would have to conclude that that war is being lost by the Ukrainians and their American funders and suppliers of weaponry versus the Russians that are winning, gaining more territory literally with every passing week and month, and the Ukrainians giving up territory, which is as good as any other measure of how that war is going. I won't say the United States lost, but I would say it's in the process of losing, and that's where things are going now. Okay, from Vietnam lost in 1975 to Ukraine being lost as we speak, we are talking of half a century, just shy of half a century, of warfare by the United States against a series of enemies, where in each case of these four major engagements, the United States lost. That's a military story of a declining empire, not an ascending one, a declining one. Vietnam was in the position of having overthrown an old empire, the French. Vietnam used to be called French Indochina, and then turning around and having to get rid of another empire, that of the United States. You should see these as signs, military signs, of a declining empire. An empire discovering that on the one hand you have nuclear weapons, which can do untold and uncontrollable damage. On the other hand, you're being forced to learn that even if you have nuclear weapons, even if you have the ability to destroy the world several times over, when it comes to the actual wars that threaten your dominance as a global empire, which these wars all did, one way or another, you don't have the non-nuclear capability to win them. Please keep that in your mind as you think about everything else. Okay, now I want to turn to economics. What does it mean to say that the U.S. empire is declining in terms of its economics? Are we not a very rich country? We are. Here in the United States, we are. Are we still a very powerful force in the larger world economy? Yes, we are. But is it also possible that this position is in decline? I'm afraid it is. More than possible. That's the reality. And let's see how and why it works that way. Number one, and we could start with many places, but I'm going to start here. For most of the last 70 years, since the end of World War II, the single most important currency in the world, used in country after country for international buying and selling of goods and services, especially crucial things like oil and gas, or for investments from one part of the world in another. Whether you look at the movement of goods or services, or cash or capital, the dollar was the currency to have and to use. It played in the world of the last 70 years the kind of role played in the previous century by the British pound. The pound sterling was as good as gold. Wow. That's not the case anymore. Country after country, region after region, industry after industry are making less use of dollars than they once did. Given the enormous dominance of the dollar, its decline still leaves it an important global currency, perhaps even the most important, but not in the dominant way it once was. Saudi Arabia demanded dollars for oil once upon a time, but it doesn't now. It trades oil all over the world for all kinds of other currencies. And that is happening into other goods and services. It is happening in the rest of the world. I will be telling you a little bit later how it's accelerating the decline of the dollar. Perhaps its most iconic use was as a reserve held in central banks around the world, who could make the rest of the world deal in the currency of Europe or of Asia or of Africa or anywhere else to the degree that they had in their central bank dollars as the reserve to say, if ever you don't want to have our currency, we are here prepared with dollars to give you dollars, and that would mean you're comfortable working with our currency because it has the backing of the dollar. The dollar as a currency was once 80-90% of what almost every world bank held as its reserve, gold and dollars. Now, maybe 50% is held in dollars. And what's replacing it? Euros, Chinese yuan, Japanese yen, and so on. The dollar is not what it was. And that's a sign of the decline of an empire. Let me turn next to competition. Emerging out of World War II, the United States had a peculiar position in the world that we really cannot forget. Knowing that history, even in this sketchy overview I'm about to give you, will help you understand the significance of where we are and where we are going. At the end of World War II, every other economy that might have been in a position to effectively compete with the United States in the world economy was destroyed. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the major economies of Europe had all been decimated by the war, either economically ruined or bombed into smithereens, with huge portions of their working age population dead or wounded, cities destroyed, railroads bombed, you name it. They couldn't compete with the United States the way they once had. We can go further and look at Russia, China, India, Japan, likewise wrecked, either by their long-standing poverty going into that period of time, that would be India and China, or the degree to which the war ravaged them, that would be Russia and Japan. Bottom line, no competitors, no serious competitors to the United States. And to make this even more dramatic, remember that the United States came out of World War II stronger economically than it went in. It went in after 10 years, more than 10 years of the greatest depression capitalism had ever gone through, the 1930s. World War II happens at the end of that period. The United States was still suffering many, many millions of people unemployed. The war allowed the United States to take these unemployed people, put half of them into uniforms to fight the war, and put the other half to work making the uniforms and the guns and the bullets and the ships and the planes that the war required. It brought this country closer to full employment than it had ever been before or than it has ever been since. Remarkable. The United States emerges strong, stronger than it went in, and everybody else the opposite. An extraordinary period. And the second half of the 20th century was an extraordinary period. It was the takeoff and the realization of the American empire. The British were long gone. Their empire had faded away at the end of the 19th century. Maybe you could argue it lasted a bit into the 20th, but not for long. Between World War I and the Great Depression of the 30s, and then World War II, any hope that the British Empire would survive was finished. All of its colonies, or nearly all, broke away. India, the prize of the British Empire, end of World War II, that was the end. India became an independent country under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. And much of the rest did too. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Kenya in East Africa, where they made a revolution against being part of the British Empire called the Mau Mau Revolution, which in the end defeated the British. They stayed a few more years, but it was finished, as it was pretty much everywhere else. But the United States could and did, after World War II, step into the empire that was no longer able to continue to be an empire. You might say of the United States, its empire rose on the ashes of the one that went before. Much as the British, if you read their history, understood that they arose on the ashes of the Dutch Empire, and that they arose, and you keep on going back to the Greeks and the Romans and the many empires the world has seen in the last few thousand years. But that too, as I'll tell you at the end of today, may be coming to an end. This notion that the world is a place of successive empires. And please keep in mind, every empire of which we have any record was born out of the ashes of another, grew over time, changed over time, peaked, and then declined. In that way, the U.S. empire is no different. It was born out of the ashes of the British. It grew spectacularly, particularly across the 20th century. And then it peaked at the turn of the century. And now it is in decline. And while that may be depressing, there is something good about it, because we have the history of lots of others. We have Mr. Gibbon telling us about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. We've studied the declines. We know that it's hard on the people living through a decline. But because we know it, because we've studied it, because we can and do make comparisons, we are in a position to make the decline of the American empire much less traumatic, much less violent than others have been, if we're wise enough to face and accept that that's a situation we're in, and then learn from history how to make it the best possible decline that we can. And as I say, I'll come back to it. One of the signs of the decline is the fact that we are no longer in a situation, as we were in at the end of World War II, with no conceivable competitor. We now have a competitor. a very powerful and very successful competitor. And we've really not had that for a century. So it's a long time that the United States has been on the way up, economically speaking, getting richer, getting stronger in comparison with pretty much the rest of the world. That's now over. And one of the most difficult things for Americans has been, and still is, to come to terms with what I just said. The competitor, in case you have any doubt, is the People's Republic of China. They are now outproducing the United States in many industries. They have achieved the same level of high-tech proficiency that the United States has, so that in some areas the United States is still a bit ahead. In other areas, the Chinese have gotten ahead, and that's shifting and changing every day, except with the following pattern. The Chinese are clearly on the way up. The United States is trying to hold on. Very different. Over the last 30 to 40 years, capitalism in the United States did something extraordinary. Not extraordinary for capitalism, it did what capitalism always does, but extraordinary for where it did it. Here's what I mean. Capitalism has always moved its dynamic center. The modern capitalism starts in the 17th, 18th century in England. That's where it explodes in growth, and it's dynamic, pulling people and resources off the countryside into the urban industrial area. The modern cities emerge the way they still look, centers of capitalist industry and growth. But then, over time, capitalism did what it always does. It moved. Its dynamic center moved. That dynamic center left Great Britain and moved to the Western European continent. It took off in places like Belgium, Netherlands, France, then a bit later Germany, Italy, and so on. Eventually it moved from Europe to North America, and then it moved to Japan, and then it became global. In all of those situations, capitalism moved. The center of economic growth and dynamic change shifted, relocated. Here in the United States, it's very easy to see. It's right on the surface. If you travel in the first locations of capitalist industry in the United States, the New England states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, those areas are covered to this day with the very same brick buildings, 3-4 stories high, that housed the initial capitalist industries there. But those brick buildings, those old factories, are empty. You know what's in there now? Yoga studios, leather craftsmen and women, and so on. The center of capitalist industry moved. It left New England and went to what we call the mid-Atlantic states. And then it went to the Midwest. Chicago became the great center. Detroit and Cleveland became the great centers. You go to Detroit and Cleveland today, they are collapsed entities. Why? Because capitalism not only came there, it also left there. And then it went to the American South and the American Southwest and the Far West, and it moved. What was remarkable in the end of the 20th century was not that capitalism moved, it always does that, but it left the United States for the first time. American capitalism didn't do that before. Not on that scale. Starting in the 1960s and 70s, we have an exodus of capital. the core of capitalist enterprise leaves the United States. It goes somewhere else. And over the last 30 to 40 years, from now, counting back, we kind of know where the most dynamic centers of capitalism turned out to be. They weren't in the United States anymore. Maybe here or there was still a dynamic capitalist growth area, high tech in Silicon Valley in California might be one, and imitations of that in a few other places. But mostly went to China or India or Brazil or a whole host of other places where what? Where the same dynamic of capitalism operated as it always had. Capitalists left where the profits were relatively low to the places where the profits were relatively high. China offered to the United States capitalists and to European capitalists and to Japanese capitalists an extraordinary deal ever since the 1970s and 80s. Here's the deal. We want to stop being one of the poorest countries on earth, which China was. We want to develop into a modern, industrial, middle-class type country with the standards of living that go with that. That's what we want. It's what you already have, they said, pointing towards us. But we want that too. And so we're going to go to the capitalist industries of the world and we're going to offer them a deal. We will give you really well-trained, well-educated, disciplined workers that we have trained in our schools, workers who are relatively healthy, relatively well-educated, but will work for wages a small fraction of what you're paying in the United States. And number two, we're going to give you access to the market here in China. We are the largest country on this planet by population. China was that until a year or two ago when India took over that position. And they said our economy is growing quickly, which it now was. So we're the biggest population and we're growing quickly. Here's what we offer you. The fastest growing market in the world right now. So you can come here to China, get some of the cheapest, best labor in the world, and you can sell into one of the biggest and largest and fastest growing markets in the world. That's a 1-2 deal no capitalist can afford not to pay attention to. It's what you learn in business school should make your decision for you. You go where the wages are low and the market is big and growing. China had it all. And what did China demand in exchange? 2 things. 1, share your technology. You've been working at this capitalism for a long time. We're new at it. We're a poor agricultural country just getting into modern industrialization. We need your help, your experience. And the second thing is we are going to be able to produce a lot, but we don't have the networks of distributing it. So we would like your help in distributing what can be produced best here, but needs to find its way into the store where people with money will buy it in many other parts of the world. We want to become a powerful, export-oriented economy, the Chinese said, and that's what they've done. That's why you have so many goods that say in them, made in China. But you know where you got them? You got them from Walmart and from Target and from many other outlets that had to find their connection to the Chinese, who had to find their connection to Walmart so that Walmart could become the biggest retailer in the world by offering the world Chinese goods. Better quality than most, cheaper than most. That was a marriage made in commercial heaven. The Chinese on one side, Walmart, Target, Amazon, and all the other retailers on the other. And they both made a lot of money. Walmart became the monster it is today. So did Amazon. China became the industrial powerhouse, the competitor that the United States had not foreseen it would face. And now that competitor is doing what new competitors always do to the old ones against whom they measure their own growth. The old ones feel threatened. The old ones don't want competition. But they can't stop it. They never can. They can slow it. They can block it. In the end, they can't stop it. There are too many ways around. So far, I'm with confidence telling you that the Chinese will manage to get around the blockages that are being thrown in their way. And it's kind of sad to watch the United States throw one blockage after another and then be disappointed that it doesn't work. That's true with the tariffs Mr. Trump started throwing at the Chinese when he was president. It's true with the tariffs and other obstacles thrown in the path of the Chinese by Mr. Biden. It's true of the same thing being done by certain European countries against the Chinese. Very predictable. It doesn't work very well. And it is all, whether it works or not, a sign that one is declining. That's the one throwing in all the obstacles, and the other one isn't. That's why the United States is now giving subsidies, building tariff walls, and the Chinese, led by the head of their Communist Party, Xi Jinping, becoming the advocate of free trade in the world, of course, because he knows he wins that one. He doesn't want the obstacles. Let's have the competition. We've worked for 50 years in China to be able to outcompete the United States, and we can. You see which empire is declining and which is rising. There's another way to understand all of this, which is what I tend to talk about more, so I'm a little less inclined to do so now. But I will mention it because it should be. The United States has 6 major allies, economically speaking. They're called the G7, the group of 7. The United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. 7. They were once, with the United States, the absolute dominant players in the whole world. When it came to exports, imports, capital movements, loans, financing, you name it, the G7 was it. And that was the dominant player until the year 2020. Not that long ago, 4 years. That was the year that the lines crossed and a new group of nations emerged that could and did contest with the G7. It's called the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to which another 6 countries have been added, and another at least dozen have now applied formally or informally to join them. The year 2020 was when the size, the wealth of the G7 finally faced the reality that the BRICS had caught up with them. The year 2020 was when they were about equal, and equal in the following meaning. If you add up the GDP of every one of the G7 countries, and remember, GDP is simply a rough measure of the total output of goods and services in 1 year that occur in a country. So you take all 7 of the G7 countries, you add up the GDP of each one, and you get the total gross product of the 7 big powers in the world, the G7. And on the other hand, you do the same for the BRICS countries, starting with their powerhouse center, China. And you add Russia, India, and all the rest. In 2020, they were about equal. Today, they're not equal anymore. The BRICS have surged ahead, and the G7 have shrunk. The G7 today may be 28, 29% of global GDP, and the BRICS 33, 34% of global GDP. There is a new sheriff in town. There's a new economic powerhouse in the world economy. And it's outgrowing the old one. The competition is there, but also who's winning and losing is right out there to see. And it's going on year in, year out. It's going on as I speak to you. And there's nothing on the horizon that's going to change that. The gap between the two is going to get larger. And what it is doing is changing the world economy radically. Every country on earth, ours included, but every country large and small in Asia, Africa, Latin America, are rethinking their economic situation. Because if they need a big loan, they don't just go to New York or London the way they once did. They could now go, and they do now go, to Beijing or to New Delhi or to Moscow. Yeah, they're going to go somewhere else, and they're at the very least going to say, well, what will you do for me? What will you do for me? And they're going to for sure go to the BRICS because they're richer than the G7 now. They have more money with which to cut deals with smaller and medium-sized countries around the world that are needy one way or another. And those countries are going to realign themselves. They're going to behave differently because the world economy has changed. The old empire is declining, and something new is emerging, and now the new thing is richer than the old one, and there is no limit to how many people are going to go, how far in adjusting to this new reality. The United States can continue, as it has, tragically, to try to stop this. But it's losing the wars, and it's losing in the diplomatic arena too. I'm going to give you two examples of how the changed economy is changing the politics and indeed the very culture we're living through. Let's do the politics first. When the United States decided to fight back against the Russians once they invaded Ukraine, the United States undertook to organize, and did organize, what its leaders referred to as the mother of all sanctions. They said we're going to bring Russia to its knees because we're going to shut off the Europeans who buy Russian oil and gas because that's all that country really lives off. So if you cut off the export markets of Russian oil and gas, you bring the country to its knees. And by cutting off, they didn't just mean we won't buy the oil we once did from you, and we won't buy the gas, but we'll literally blow up the pipeline in the North Sea scheduled to bring it to us so nobody can possibly push oil or gas through. We mean business. We're going to stop it. The ruble will collapse. Russia will collapse. That huge country by geography can be broken up into the different ethnicities that compose it. Heady talk in the early months of 2022. But it was all a terrible mistake. It didn't work. The Russian ruble today is worth as much, if not more, than it was before the invasion of Ukraine took place. Russian economic growth has picked up during the 2.5 years of war. That seems to have surprised the leaders in Washington, but it shouldn't have. Remember what I told you about World War II? It strengthened the economy of the United States as a combatant in the war. The United States should have known better than anybody that war can work in another way, because that's what's happened in Russia. They miscalculated, and the Ukrainian economy is a shambles because of it. Many cities in Ukraine are ruins. You see it on TV. You all know what I'm talking about. Turned out Russia could sell its oil and gas somewhere else. Didn't need the Europeans. Didn't need the United States. They turned to their allies in the BRICS, China and India, said, would you please buy our oil and gas instead of selling it to the West? We'll sell it to you. Done, said Mr. Modi in India. Done, said Xi Jinping in China. Should have understood that that's what's happening. If you see what's going on in the world, none of this should surprise you. But our leaders don't want to see it. They confront the declining empire with denial, with pretending it isn't happening. You know, a small child pretends that a scary dog can disappear if you just cover your eyes and don't see it. And then when the little child gets a little older, the child matures and discovers that the doggy can still be there when you cover your eyes and don't see it. But American leaders are children in this regard. They think if you act and talk, prance around as if you were what you once were, the dominant empire of the world, that everybody will treat you that way forever. But they won't. The whole world is in a process now of withdrawing from the mentality of the dominant American empire. People are seeing the whole society they live in, we live in their country, in their region, in the whole world, as being one that they want to say no to. They want something different. Being part of a declining empire is not attractive. The future doesn't look good. You don't feel positive, and you act that out, even if you deny everything that I'm describing in terms of declining empire. You act it out, you feel it, even if you can't yet put it into words and concepts the way I'm trying to do with you now. Here are some signs besides a terrible miscalculation around the war in Ukraine. The second example has to do with Israel and Gaza and Palestine. The assumption here seems to have been that because we have a long history, half a century, of alliance between the United States and Israel, that this would be understood and accepted, more or less as it has been in the past, with whatever grumbling went along with that, which not that many people took seriously. Well, the world has changed, but the people making policy in Washington don't want to face that, because it would take them too close to what we're talking about, the decline of the American empire. So Mr. Biden assumed that the American political system would rally around him and that the global system would basically do the same with whatever grumbling local politics might require of a few politicians in the Middle East and in the Muslim world. But he was wrong. An enormous part of the world, and not just in the Middle East, and not just Islamic, decided that what was going on in Israel, Gaza, was unacceptable on the part of the Israelis. They were the bad people. They were the perpetrators. They might have been the victims on the 7th of October. They might have been victims in the Holocaust that is studied historically, but they're not the victims in this situation, and the rest of the world said so. They said so in meetings at the United Nations. They said so in votes at the United Nations. Even in the home of the United States, as well as inside Israel, significant popular movements against official Israeli-U.S. policies. Wow. And being surprised by that, which they were, acting in wildly inappropriate ways, as half a dozen universities here in the United States did by punishing students advocating peace in the Middle East and punishing them violently. That was a punishment that had nothing to do with the issue. You don't violently oppress students that are marching for peace unless there's something else at stake. And those university presidents and those police departments with them, you know what they're battling? The decline of the U.S. empire. And they are outraged that local students should be seen as they are, as somehow sympathetic with or active with those that are supporting the decline. It has nothing to do with supporting decline. The decline is a reality that is unfolding with or without people's support. It's Americans who are having a trouble facing it, understanding it, and dealing with it. And here's a final example. We recently have had elections in France and Britain, and we're facing an election soon in the United States. And I want to call your attention to something that I think you'll see in all three of them. We've seen it already in France and Britain, and we will likely see something like it this fall. There is a wholesale rejection of the political leaderships of the past. Let's begin with France briefly. The president of France, Emmanuel Macron, received 20% of the key votes in the parliamentary elections in France. 4 out of 5 French voters want him gone. It is a rejection of the existing status quo, a demand for change. By all means, where to go instead of this is very murky in French thinking. You can see that because you have a quasi-fascistic party under Le Pen going in those kinds of directions, anti-immigrant, nationalistic, and then you have a very powerful unified left. Wow, the country is in such trouble that the communists and the socialists and the Greens and the independent leftists all got together in a new popular front. And they did better than Macron, too. A lot better. Macron came in third after the right wing and the left wing. And that isn't going to change anytime soon. That's a rejection of the old and a desperate desire for something different. The people who win in these elections will be very badly served if they are in denial too. You're not getting votes because of what you are. You're getting votes because you're not the old that everybody knows they don't want. Let's cross the British Channel and go to England. The Conservative Party has been running England for the last 12 years. What the vote accomplished in England on the 4th of July, 2024, was the absolute, total, and unmistakable rejection of the Conservative Party, which ran the country, was the sitting incumbent political party, is now a tiny fraction. The Labour Party, to the left of the Conservatives, not much, but a little, the Labour Party has 470 seats in the Parliament, and the Conservative Party has 100. I mean, a complete rejection. Do the people love the Labour Party and its new leader, Mr. Starmer? Not at all. The vote for them wasn't much different from what it was years ago. You didn't see people leaving other parties and going to the Labour Party. What you saw was supporters for what was there before saying, we don't support you anymore. We don't know where to go. We might vote for them, we might vote. But the only important thing for us is not to vote for you. And here in the United States, we've had several elections which are pretty heavily shaped by a desire of people, not him again, with whoever is sitting in office. No, we don't want that. We want change. I want to conclude by talking about what comes next. Where are we going with this? And I want you to think with me about some what-if kinds of questions. And I want to start where you have to start, I think. The rise of the People's Republic of China, its alliance with the BRICS, and the increasingly dominant position all of this represents. And I want to leave you with a question because I can't answer it. You can't, I can't. But often, as Albert Einstein used to say, the question you ask is more important than the answer. It's the question that directs you as to where to look for whatever answers you find, and therefore is the key thing. So I want to leave you with a question. China and its allies are arriving in that kind of ascendant position that puts them at a place where they're going to have to make a choice, whether they're conscious of it or not. And I want to make it explicit because I want all of us to do what we can to push that choice in one of the two directions. China may go and do what countries in China's position, including the United States, did in the past. In other words, on the ashes of the declining U.S. empire, China may erect a new empire that we will all come to call the Chinese Empire, much as we call the U.S. empire or the British Empire, or on and on back to the Roman and the Greeks. But there's an option. There always was, and now we can put it on the table. The Chinese could decide that maybe we are ready as a species, as a human community, not to have a new empire replacing the declining old one. Maybe we can graduate and become a global population that really is multi-centered, multicultural, multipolar, whatever words you enjoy, in which the Chinese are one, but by no means the dominant one. There will be no dominant one. There will be a decision by all that there none of them be dominant. It's like the decision made some centuries ago in many parts of the world. No more kings and queens. No more. It's not we're going to get rid of this one and have the next one. Get rid of the father, pick up the son. Get rid of both of them and make the new king come from somewhere. No, it's like what happened in the American Revolution. The Americans broke away from Britain, ruled by King George III. But they didn't set up their own king, George Washington. They didn't. They made the decision, no more kings. Not British, not French, not anything. Wow. They were aware of how daring they were in moving to the republic that they dreamed about. Well, the Chinese might do it too. They might say, not we won't have kings, they've done that already, but we are not going to be the empire. We're not going to develop that way. We're going to develop in a different way. That's a big if. What if the Chinese did that? What would be the proper reaction of the United States? We are living through a presidential campaign where none of these issues is even being raised, where we're pretending we're not at the cusp of this enormous historical decision, which is in the process of being made, only without an American participation, because it's too busy trying to hold back the Chinese, which isn't working anyway. I'm going to close with asking you another what-if question about where we are. Suppose that there's a basic issue facing China, the United States, and everybody else in the world today that you haven't thought about, that hasn't been in the public eye. Here's the change. All production in the world, the producing of food, clothing, shelter, means of transportation, you name it. All workplaces in the world, with a few exceptions, factories, offices, stores, are organized in a very particular way, and they have been for a long time. A tiny group of people sits at the top of these workplaces. They are the owner of the company, the board of directors of the corporation. We all know who they are. We don't know them personally because most of us are not part of this group. Let's call them the employers. Private citizens in the United States and UK, government officials in the USSR and half of China. They may be private, they may be governmental, but they're a tiny group of employers either way. And the mass of people, Chinese, American, and everybody else, are employees, hired and fired by those employers. The employers have all the basic economic power. They direct the employees, you and me, what to do, where to do it, how to do it. And when we finish with producing the goods and services, they belong to the employer. We made them, they get them. And they decide what to do with them or whatever money they get if they sell them. And they give most of that money to themselves, which is why they are rich and we aren't. Now here comes the big what if. What if that's the problem? What if that's not the only way to organize workplaces? What if an alternative exists already around us called worker co-ops or names like that, which are organized differently, which don't have a small group at the top, in which the employees are their own employers, and the employees are themselves both employee and employer, so that the distinction disappears. Nobody is one or the other. Everybody is both. Now we will run the workplace like any other community of equals. And because we've learned about democracy, we want one person, one vote. That's how we're going to do. And what if the problems of the world that have bedeviled us, climate change, inequality, instability of job and community, what about reorganizing the workplace might solve those problems? Shouldn't we be discussing that? Shouldn't that be first and foremost what these elections are about? Instead of being denied, pushed aside, pretending that this option of how to organize the workplace isn't available. That'd be as silly as saying to the people 3 centuries ago, getting rid of kings and queens isn't an option that's available. It was, of course. They showed that to us. And we can now see that there's an option in how we organize the workplace. And if there weren't a small minority, then they wouldn't be able to keep the wealth for themselves. The inequality of wealth and income would disappear. There'd be no reason for it and no institutional support for it either. And how would that change the world? My goodness, that's half of what we fight about without understanding what solution is within reach for us. The decline of an empire is a sad moment for the people who've lived through it, but it is also a moment of extraordinary opportunity to see the benefits of a new and different direction for the world to take. If we don't change the way we're doing it, we're going to see violent conflict as human beings, inside and outside all of these societies, struggle through the decline of one empire. Here in the United States and in Britain and Europe, it's already obvious. The people who have wealth and power, watching the decline of their empire, are holding on as much as they can to what they have. And they have the wealth and power to hold on pretty tightly. And you know what that means for the mass of the employees? They pay. Their standard of living ebbs away because those at the top hold on. Someone's wealth and income have to give. They're not going to let it be them. So it's us. And whether it's inflation that takes it away from us, or a change in taxes that does that, or the substitution of lousy jobs for better jobs, it's all of a piece. It's all part of an adjustment to what our leaders pretend isn't going on. That may fool us for a while, but in the end, I think there's a basis for hoping that wiser heads will prevail and understand both what we are facing and what new opportunities it gives us for the kinds of changes that can make all the difference in the world. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward in a short number of weeks of speaking with you again. Thank you.